Hello, today we are continuing our psychological astrology series on unconscious motivations, September 14th, 2024. So last class, and I don't know, Haley, if you attended the conscious motivations, but we did more of like the sun, Mars, Jupiter. Um, and now this is the follow-up for the unconscious. So we can start to see the chart from the conscious and the unconscious motivations to see the things that are very overt in ourselves that we might be very well aware, like our self-esteem or our motivation to ambition, things that were goal-oriented and outcomes. But the unconscious really is a thing that's driving us. And it's that part of us that's unknown. So today we're going to talk about Freud and his death drive theory, Jung and his theory of the unconscious. And I like to present it from a psychological framework so you can start to see how these theorists took the psyche and how they understood it and how astrology fits in. Attachment theory, understanding the role of the moon, which is linked directly to attachment theory. Chiron, which is also linked somewhat to attachment theory and Jung's unconscious, and linking Neptune and Pluto, and you'll see that in my diagram, back to both the death drive and how we kind of move in the world idealistically, trying to hide the impact of the moon and the Chiron. And all of these planets in one way or another are dictating unconscious motivations, and we'll kind of tie it all together in the practice with our charts. So when we talk about the unconscious, and the unconscious and the subconscious are used somewhat simultaneously, but the unconscious, they're the unknowns that are in your way that you don't even know are in your way. So if someone meets you or you meet another person and it's obvious to you that a person has some character traits or have some patterns and habits that they don't identify, you can identify that that's something that's hidden from them, that they're aspects of them themselves that they really aren't clear about. And we all have these sort of blinders on with who we are. These blinders are somewhat dictated by our upbringing, our childhood, obviously our culture, our family history, ancestry, and what we're allowed to view ourselves as in the world. But they're in the background working and dictating a lot of our beliefs and our behaviors. And if we're not aware of them, we're sort of blindsided when Pluto comes in to make them very clear and clearly known to us. So the more that we can do this sort of unconscious work to really understand mirroring, projecting, how we kind of situate ourselves in the world and what we're attracting, that really gives us the insight to our unconscious. So you don't always know what you do and why you do something. There is a hidden agenda in the psyche. The way I like to explain it is that we have a box, and this is our box or our ego, and we kind of wear these sort of glasses or this limitation of how we see the world, the way we move ourselves in relationship and work, in social activities, and anything outside the parameters of that box is part of that unconscious. We may easily see it in another person, but we don't see it in ourselves. And we will talk about Pluto and Neptune in relationship to this. But the goal of this box, besides for our ego to drive it and to let us continue in our worldview that was told that it was the only way, and we all have that box that says this is the only way, is to keep us kind of moving forward and being outcome oriented, achieve our goals, marry the person we were told to marry, have the job we were told to have. That's the purpose of the box. But everything else, and this is where judgments are confessions and their great comes in, anything else outside of the box is a judgment that we have, is related to something unconscious and unbeknownst to us, that is part of our own identity and calling a lot of our shots in our life without even being aware. This is what keeps us in vicious cycles, like the dog chasing its tail. We have the same pattern over and over and over again. We don't know how to break out of these patterns. I'm not a believer that you break out of patterns, but you grow, you sort of grow out of, instead of grow out of something, you kind of just expand upon and have a different perspective or viewpoint as to what a pattern is and your dynamic or your place in the pattern. And this is the traditional insanity, doing something over and over again and expecting results. So whether it's saying the same thing to your children, dating the same person, following the same diet, whatever pattern you're kind of stuck in is outside of that box that's calling the shots, and we don't know how to break out of it. So when we look at the chart with the lens through the unconscious and understanding why we get caught up in these patterns, now we have an option to not continue hiding these truths or hiding this agenda, but rather owning it, integrating, individuating from it, and then achieving wholeness, which is really the point. Any questions so far?
No.
So are we motivated to self-destruct? So I did a retreat earlier this year, and I asked the group, who has self-love, who fully loves themselves? And nobody raised their hand. And then I said, who wants to have self-worth? And everybody raised their hand. And then I asked, who thinks they can achieve full self-worth? And nobody raised their hand. And they want to, but it's unachievable. And I think this is a really important thing to discuss, because this self-help industry that we are part of has harmed us all. We have this notion that we're supposed to love ourselves fully and be worthy, and anything that is either self-destructive or ugly about ourselves, or poor habits, or even dating the wrong person, or putting up with an intolerable behavior from a boss or a child, is supposed to be something that we run from, that we don't tolerate. And that is not the truth at all. The unconscious is there to make conscious so that we can recognize that we are indeed the type of people, and all of us are in our own capacity, that has the capacity to self-destruct, to be neglectful, to allow abuse in our lives, to allow intolerable behavior to continue. That's really what we're here to achieve. That's the only level of worth and self-love that we can fully achieve. And so when we talk about Chiron and the moon, we're kind of set up to already be limited and fragmented and broken and lack self-worth and lack self-love. But we think we have to hide all of that, and that we should show up as worthy, and we should show up as, all that, and full of self-love. And that is the furthest thing from the truth. And so we're all of us in this field are in this dynamic, in this same cyclical pattern, that we don't necessarily like ourselves, that we feel perhaps broken or empty inside. We don't have answers. We don't know what we're doing. And yet we're putting on this face or running from situations that don't look good, because the self-help industry has said it should look a certain way, when that is nothing further than the truth. And so it's really when the unconscious becomes conscious, it's really about a yes and. It's about recognizing that I am the type of person that can tolerate abuse or neglect, or I'm self-disgusted, but yet allow grace and mercy in. And so we'll see with the positioning of the planets why they're all working for us to achieve that. Because nobody in a human form, nobody who has a body, nobody who has emotions, nobody who thinks thoughts is capable of full self-love and full worthiness. That's the opposite of our job. Our job is to love ourselves despite, and others, of course, despite our low self-worth, our ability to tolerate, poor behavior and abuse, our ability to be self-destructive, That's the goal. The goal is saying, I can own all of this that isn't worthy and allow grace and mercy to still enter into our lives. And that's how we lend it to others as well, or give back and serve to others as well. So it's just important to name this and speak to this, that self-love and self-worth is not the name of the game, but rather achieving self-acceptance that may be named self-love and worthiness, but it's really full self-acceptance of all of the fragments and parts. That's the goal. So we all do not feel enough in certain areas. We're going to look at the moon and Chiron particularly. This will speak to where we don't feel enough and we're not supposed to. We are all committed to family and generational patterns of suffering. We see that through the moon. We are limited in these areas and we overcompensate in both Chiron and the moon. We don't want others to know what we really think of ourselves. This has to do with the Neptune, and then we'll play that off with the Pluto and how we stop overcompensating, but rather lead to acceptance. And we unconsciously send signals to others as we got signals sent to us in the womb, this relational pattern with attachment theory, that that we're weak, that we're not worthy, and we're not deserving an unconditional love. And so as we make these unconscious patterns conscious, we can recognize that we no longer have to hide or overcompensate for areas that we are indeed feeling weak or unworthy or not unconditionally loved, and rather just hold that and recognize that we're still worthy of the grace and mercy that the world can offer us despite these things. So it stops that kind of chase. When we're ego motivated, when we're more consciously motivated, like last class, we're kind of chasing something that doesn't exist. It's that grass is greener syndrome, or, oh, I'm going to dump this person and find someone else, and we end up with the same person because there's nothing over there. It's always here. But it's a matter of perspective, the unconscious. When you're looking that way and you think there's something over there that's better for you, you're chasing. When you stop to look inward and you stop to say who I am at this moment, tolerating this behavior, not being timely, let's say, understanding that I'm just a person that doesn't keep my word, whatever that is when the unconscious can begin to become conscious. And so that stopping of owning of, yes, I am these things, I'm capable of these things. From that point, we can do unconscious work. But if we're constantly chasing something better over there, we're just consciously motivated. We haven't stopped to do that internal, more shadowy work of self-acceptance. So it really is a positioning of how we view ourselves and what we consider to be outside of us. So Freud said that we all had death drives, thanatos, and we are wired to self-destruct. And so this death drive is participatory in creating these self-destructive behaviors that we all have. Again, this is related to overcompensating. When we can't overcompensate anymore, that sort of pendulum swing, right? We've overworked. Now we have to get sick to honor the self-destructiveness that we're lazy, let's say, and we need to rest. And so in Freud's model, everything but the conscious mind, just this 10% of the iceberg, is below the surface of the psyche. So 90% of us is unconscious and unbeknownst to us. So our box is very small in this model, right? What we see in the mirror, what we think about ourselves, perhaps what the world is telling us or our parents have told us, what we consciously can identify is just 10% of this. I put the glyph of Pluto here because you're going to see it in Jung's model. I put it in a different place. The reason I put the Pluto glyph here is that Pluto represents that devil or that Satan that we might associate with. And so if we have Pluto, Satan, or devil, we think that something is happening to us, or someone's doing something to us, right? Someone stole our husband, someone stole our job, someone broke into our car. When we recognize that this is us, it's just outside of our box that is unconscious, and we can bring it to a conscious state, then we can actually start to realize, oh, everything is my doing, and that these things are actually being done to us. You know, the Scorpio, as we talk about death drive, that all of these things are being done for us so that we can recognize, oh, there's a pattern here. I have a client who probably for the past 30 years, she gets scammed on the internet. She gets scammed on phone calls. She went and delivered a check in the mailbox at her local post office. They robbed her mail, her check. They whited it out and put like double the amount. Like she's constantly in these schemes, and she has a moon in Gemini. So there's a pattern here that appears to be that she's not doing it, right? Someone is scamming her. And so we have to stop to go, okay, how many of these patterns and cycles are we going to attribute outside before we stop and say, wait a minute, I have to look at what's going on inside. And so that Pluto, even though we live it as someone being the thief or the betrayer outside, Freud sort of orients us to, oh, it's us. We are creating those patterns so that we can self-destruct. And in Jung's vision, which I'll share now, is actually so that we can become whole, individuated, and integrated. So Jung, being a student of Freud and then creating his own school of analytical psychology, he took his model of the psyche and unconscious and consciousness a little different. So down here is the collective unconscious. So the collective unconscious is what we share with all of humanity. I put Chiron here and the moon, and that's really the basis of this class and why these other glyphs and planets matter. Every human being comes from a womb. It's a shared universal experience. There's not much of that we can say. And every one of us comes from a womb. So our moon is related to our womb experience. So the moon is part of the collective unconscious. We're going to go through the signs, and this book you might have already. My book, The Shadow Side of the Mother's Love, goes through each of the signs in depth as to why this is a shared human experience, but the sign makes you live it your way. But every single one of us has an experience in the womb, which is limited, which is connected to the way we think love should be given, or the way we receive it. Universal. So the key word of the collective unconscious is universal experience. Our Chiron is our wounding, also another universal experience. So when we leave the universal consciousness, heaven, God, the universe, the creator, whatever you believe in, and you're put into a body, right, into the womb, you're confined to what was a universal womb and now confined into a maternal womb, the moon. And in that womb, you got a conditional version of love, your version of love, and you got wounding because you're automatically fragmented and limited. You're no longer whole and one with the universe. You're now in a body, fragmented and limited. This Chiron is where we try to overcompensate. It is a universal feeling of not enoughness, fear of rejection, fear of abandonment. It is the fall. It is the being kicked out of the Garden of Eden. And so every human being has a Chiron and a moon, and that is to cover up. Eventually, they want to cover up that wounding, hence the self-help industry. You can't cover up your Chiron and you can't cover up your moon. Those are universal experiences. So if we are in a constant seeking external, running away from the exact thing that makes us human and unified as a humanity, We're constantly feeling separate from the exact thing that we want to be joined to, which is other humans, the interconnectedness of all, and of course, the interconnectedness of the universe that we all come from. So this is a shared collective unconscious experience, and why these other planets support for us to have bringing the unconscious conscious. Now, what happens? We think it's just us. We think that we're the ones that were rejected. We think the ones that our inner child was stunted. We think our parents didn't love us unconditionally. And automatically in the psyche, we create a Neptune. We take our universal experience, we make it personal, and we say, oh, back to the box. This is the way it should be. Your mother should be at home wearing a house dress and making cookies when you get home from school. Your father should be home at 5 o'clock and the happy family of the children and the mom and the dad. And we create an idealism that does not exist. This is one of the biggest culprits in the chart as to why we stay in our box. Because we're trying to hide the universal experience that we're all wounded and we're all loved conditionally. So now the place of our Neptune says, oh, as long as I believe this ideal and work towards that, I never have to fully own that I can never be worthy, that I can never be enough, that I can never be loved unconditionally. And that's the vicious cycle and the vicious patterns that we're in, to self-destruct. And any idealism is going to lead us to self-destruction, because we need to integrate all that is, not the fantasy world that we want to live in. So here he has the ego, right? So again, that sort of narrative and framework, our limited ego of what life should be like. And back to Freud's unconscious, where Pluto, in Jung's unconscious, now at the consciousness level, Pluto becomes that devil or that fate or that destiny that you just are like, why do I have this over and over and over again? And here you have your cancers, your divorces, your death of children, all the horrible things that happen in life. And these things must happen to shatter this personal unconscious, that you took something universal, made it personal so that you can just come back down here and say, no, no, no. The universe didn't do this to me. There isn't a God that wants me to suffer. I'm not getting punished for XYZ. I am simply human, and I have a wounding, and I have conditional love. And if I allow these two things to really settle in me and stop running from them, but rather hold them, then I can allow the mercy and the grace of the divine, Neptune and Pluto, universal transpersonal planets, to find a balance where life is real, life is hard, right? Life is a struggle, but I can find some innocence. I can find some compassion. I can find some service. I can find some unconditional love in a group of people, because I've given that to myself. I can give it to others. But Pluto and Neptune are there to help us to get back to this level of the collective unconscious that every single human being fears rejection, has been abandoned, has crises, has lost their innocence and naivete, and to return us back to universal themes and stop making these things personal. Questions?
No questions, just thinking about just lived this out a few days ago at work. Like, yeah, just had an experience with a coworker where I felt it was a series of experiences and something set me over the edge, and somebody made a comment and I found myself like repeating the behavior that I was detesting in the moment. And just took the opportunity to recognize in myself like what was happening and voice it to the person that I overreacted to. Like just feeling through that interruption of what can just weigh us down and create issues that don't get resolved and become
right?
beliefs. Yeah.
Because this ego is about separation, whereas consciousness, both conscious and unconscious, right, is about unity. And so Neptune, yes, is delusional. Yes, it's innocent. Yes, it's a bit of codependence. And Pluto, yes, creates endings and crisis and really terrible things. But really, without those two archetypes in the psyche, we don't get back to this collective unconscious that we're all wounded children and we all want our little innocence back and make a better world and recognize that the world is full of suffering. So that pause to recognize immediately drops you back into the collective unconscious and says, this isn't personal. And I think one of the best books is The Four Agreements, right? It's such a simple book. It's a small book, but it's so powerful. And that was one of the agreements. Don't take anything personal. And I think astrology is such a great map for that because we can see the areas where we take something personal, or we have such a focus on an innocence that we're blindsided, you know, when we've been in that sort of pattern of how we want it to look like. And Pluto comes in and says, no, I'm not helping you. I need to shatter that box so that you can see a fuller picture, so that more people, more experiences, more scenarios fit into a worldview, so that we can just come from a worldview of love, because ultimately that's the goal. This will also be reflected in planets that have quincunxes. Quincunxes are like blind sides. So when you see people that have quincunxes, we talked about that the other day in class.
Mhm.
That's where sometimes people are blindsided because they weren't having it coming. Unlike an opposition that you're expecting it to come at you, and you're like, okay, I can see why I continuously have this pattern. The quincunxes kind of, make the unconscious conscious because you weren't expecting it. So attachment theory. Attachment theory is linked mainly to the moon, but also to Chiron. I speak a lot about that in the shadow side of the Mother's Love book. So the attachment theory by Ainsworth and Bowlby in psychology speaks of the nature of emotional bonds that you get very early on with your caregivers that eventually repeats the pattern in your adult relationships, not just romantic. And so we have all learned through our moon sign and our moon house a definition of conditional love that never goes away. So it's not about, oh, I have a moon in Aries and I like to fight and I like violent relationships and I'm going to get over that and keep breaking up with people until I find someone who treats me well. It's about stopping the chasing of that and recognizing, first of all, the violence and the fighting is happening within, right? I'm the inner bully to myself and to my own inner child. But second, that I am the type of person that is capable of tolerating abusive, fighting, violent behavior. I remember when I was doing my doctoral internships, I had to work at different facilities. And I worked at Women in Distress, which is a shelter for abused women. And in the counseling space, I was very young. I was naive. I didn't know that people stayed in abusive relationships. The women were in the group counseling 20, 30 years in these relationships with, drunk men that abused them or violent. And I remember leaving there very uncomfortable and asking to go into a one-on-one counseling setting. I didn't want to be part of these groups. I felt like this just didn't make any sense. And that was part of my naivete. Not only because I'm a Pisces, but I have Neptune as the ruler of my chart. Of course, I saw this rose-colored glasses in terms of a relationship. And of course, as I grew older, I realized people have that free will and autonomy to choose in what relationship they stay. And aren't they the most sort of spirit-bound individuals that recognize their limitations and aren't running from it to just go to another relationship, but just rather accept and understand themselves as to why they are capable of tolerating that. And I found that to be absolutely fascinating. And so Chiron and the moon allow us to really understand just our limitations as human beings, why we tolerate, and it's okay, we're supposed to, right? Why we tolerate what we tolerate. And rather than judging ourselves for it, judging others for it, thinking we're wrong, thinking that we should deserve better. I'm not a big lover of the word deserve. That we are just simply humans that are capable of tolerating fill in the blank behavior. that situates us as owning our lives and recognizing I'm limited, and this is simply the Chiron and the moon that I've been dealt. And it's about coming to terms with that being an area of life that I may not find my voice. I may not know how to get out of that pattern. I may not want to get out of that pattern because maybe my own childhood self-neglect permits for that. My own womb experience with a Capricorn moon who had a cold relationship with a parent allows for me to have someone who doesn't come home for 3 days. And instead of making us chasing an ideal or Neptune that doesn't exist, we just accept certain deficiencies of ourselves as a human. It's a very different positioning. So this particular theory speaks to secure attachment. I personally do not agree that we have secure attachment at all. I think that that is something we create with our own inner child. I believe in some capacity we are all insecurely attached, as by the moon and Chiron and the sign and house it's in, creating either an avoidant, anxious, or disorganized style of relationships. So perhaps Libra, more disorganized, or Aquarius, more disorganized. I call it the jellyfish moon. You know, they give and then they pull away. They give and they pull away. I have a very anxious moon, a Cancer moon. You have a Pisces moon? Again,
Cancer moon.
another, oh, you have a Cancer moon too. Anxious. Avoidant might be like Sagittarius, non-confrontational, going off to run away, to not confront. So we see in the moon sign how attachment theory links to the womb, links to not only the psychological theory, but speaks to our insecure attachment style that never goes away. Thinking that we can take away attachment style, thinking that we can take away patterns, really is saying we cease to exist. Because these things all are inculcated at the moment of conception. So we would have to seek to exist, hence the self-destructive drive of Freud, that we want to cease to exist because we don't like being limited and we don't like having, you know, just being limited versions of ourselves and having the ability to tolerate poor behavior, either ourselves to ourselves or others to ourselves. You can see why we would have that self-destructive drive. But Pluto oftentimes will be the reason why you actually choose your life instead of your death. And it's that juxtaposition why I put it at the unconscious and the conscious in both of the models, because it kind of creates a life, death, rebirth process in us. Something I hated is now the thing I now love about myself. And we hear that about people who went through really difficult things. In the moon and the Chiron signs, we're looking for our definition of home. That's going to be different for everybody. You and I are going to have a similar style, but maybe even through the house that it's in has a little bit of a different flavor to the Cancer moon. Whereas, like I said, a moon in Aries might want a house that is full of military, war, violence, swords, who knows? But they're going to have a different vibe in terms of what they call home. And that is very, very particular. And then the Chiron is what you can tolerate in terms of treatment, because it kind of says this is where your Achilles heel is. This is where your weakness or your flaw of being human lies. And you're going to seek things that support that belief system. So belief here is very integral. And what the belief doesn't change, but your relationship with the belief changes. Because now what you thought was a negative, I allow neglect, now becomes, oh, that's what Francis of Assisi says, my poverty. My poverty is that I allow neglect. Okay, I can recognize others that are neglected and serve them. So the belief doesn't change, but that relationship with the seeming outside world, instead of running away, now we're like, oh, this is exactly the answer. So Chiron through the signs. Chiron is our main wounding. It never goes away. We all have it by sign and by house. And it's where we try to overcompensate. So you might see someone who has a Chiron in Aquarius and they're constantly saying, I have roots, I have home, I'm so stable, but they're not. That Chiron in Aquarius is feeling like they don't have a connection. They're lacking roots, they're lacking stability, but they sell you as if they're super stable. So that Chiron is really, really integral when we're realizing the unconscious motivations in a person and how they speak, specifically archetypally. You're usually going to hear the person speak the opposite of their Chiron sign so that you can identify archetypally that that's where they feel most wounded. Aries, these are also very generational. It's about 15 to 18 months in a sign. So for instance, my entire generation, we all have Aries, Chiron and Aries. So the generation speaks to feeling a lack of identity. And for many years, and I have it in my fourth, so I don't have an identity and I don't feel at home with that identity. I lived out that scapegoat story. But generationally, that sort of 15 to 18-month period, everyone in that kind of like Saturn has the same Chiron. Taurus, they lack self-worth, so they tend to seek financial stability, cars and watches and things like that to say I have self-worth, but really there's a lacking of that internally. Gemini lacks or feels, this is classic imposter syndrome, lack communication and intelligence. They think everybody else is more intelligent than they are. Cancer, they feel like they lack mother, that quintessential mother, this idea of home and unconditional love. Leo feels that they lack importance and specialness. Virgo feels incomplete and they feel impure. They lack purity. Think of the Virgin Mary. Think of the Christ consciousness. How can I have Christ consciousness in a broken vessel or an impure vessel? Libra, they lack unity and togetherness. They're always kind of looking for that harmony with others because they don't feel that they have it. Scorpio lacks safety. Scorpio is that sign that rules life and death. So if I'm in the life continuum, then death is right around the corner. If I accept that death and endings are coming, well, then I'm dealing with the next sort of cycle of life and new beginnings. So they never feel really safe because of that paradigm. Sagittarius, they lack meaning and inspiration. Maybe they're the ones that study religion and philosophy and study and travel the world, but they really never find any meaning in any of the things that they study. Capricorn lacks recognition. Aquarius lacks connection and feels alone. And Pisces lacks faith. So it seems counterintuitive, but that's what they're seeking through their wound. A full integration process, a full self-acceptance process, weaknesses and all, makes you come full circle with your Chiron. So you know enough about my theories that I have the 48 to 52 theory, right? So the 0 to 100 are the swings, and we're constantly doing the opposite or the same, right? It looks differently, but we're doing the same thing. The 48 to 52 concept is this idea of contentment, of finding balance between the two oppositions or opposing extremes. It happens to be, no shock, that at the ages of 48 to 52, Chiron makes its full return home. That's when you start realizing, oh, Dorothy, you had the slippers on all along. So it's a play on the extremes of 0 to 100 that we all have to go through, but it also speaks to the age where we are supported by the universe to pause the swings and say, wait a second, what's going on in here? Oftentimes through a Pluto, through a Neptune ship that an idealism was shattered. Pluto entered your life and said, oh my God, I have to look at things differently. So we start to see how the cycles of these planets are supporting us to get to this acceptance of our wounding and finding the answer in the problem. That really is the goal of Chiron. Chiron is also known as the Rainbow Bridge. It's not a planet, it's an asteroid, and it's right between Saturn and Uranus. Uranus was the sky god that was castrated by his son Saturn. So Uranus is chaos and freedom, and Saturn is structure and limitation. And Chiron is the one that bridges our feeling of always wanting freedom and chaos and change and getting bored with limitation and structure and finding that midpoint. And all of that begins to happen between the ages of 48 to 52. It starts at 30 when we're castrated with our Saturn return, 28 to 30. Then at 42 with Uranus, we blow up our life because both of those are prepping us for 48 to 52 years old, where Chiron enters and says there's a little bit of truth in both of those. Your Saturn return and your Uranus opposition both offer you perspectives. Can you find a bridge, a midpoint, so that you can live with both? So this age is also very special because Chiron's on its return home generationally, in your chart, in your life, and people start to say, wow, I'm rejoining with my parents, or I'm realizing that my parents weren't all that bad. You hear that kind of language around this age because people are realizing, oh, home is inside, is not a space outside. So the moon also with Chiron, as I said, the inner child, the wounded child, the lacking unconditional love because no one's loved unconditionally, shows us how we find love. This never changes. You are never going to change your love language according to your moon sign, okay? Aries seeks that fighting, abuse, violence, yelling, sort of military. Think of the god of war. Taurus is so terrified of any sort of change. They get to a point where they're actually stagnant, where things have to be crumbling to maybe even leave the physical home in which they've purchased before they can move addresses. Like it's that level of rooted in stagnation. Gemini, they're very rational. They try to rationalize the emotion, the attachment style, but they also need options. Gemini moon is the one that needs to have like 3 jobs or 3 books at a time, maybe, polyamory. They constantly need options so that they don't feel stuck. Cancer, we look for mom everywhere. And it doesn't have to be a person or a woman. It can be a quality, right, that our mom had, negative or positive. Remember, shadow and light work together, but we're constantly looking. We have these antennae that make us always constantly look for mom. Leo wants attention and specialness. Virgo looks for order and maturity. Libra moons want harmony, but they live by the adage honesty is complicated because sometimes you got to say lies to make things harmonious, right? Scorpio is in a pattern of suffering, life, and death. So they're constantly like that Urobos eating its tail. They don't know if they're dying, if they're living. They're the quintessential sort of self-destruct so that they can start something new. Sagittarius tends to look for shallowness. They don't want to go too deep, and they want to perhaps have optimism or even like a toxic positivity type of attitude. Capricorn, their moon, when moon is in Capricorn, their love language is scarcity and coldness. They actually want someone who's perhaps standoffish, who gives them strict boundaries, who isn't touchy-feely. It reminds them of the womb. Aquarius, sudden changes and instability. They thrive on that. They view that as love. And Pisces looks for magic. They may not be looking like us for the mom, the human. They're looking for the universal mother. That's also why addictions are there, because addictions are another version of universal suffering. We're all addicts in our own right. So how does Neptune support the unconscious motivations I mentioned earlier? Since we are all wounded children with Chiron and the moon, the way to feel safe in this world, somewhere, wherever you have Neptune, some people are just naturally idealistic or they are naive, but we all are naive and blindsided in one area of our chart. That will be wherever Neptune is. So there you want to remain innocent and naive. You don't want to necessarily recognize the limitations of your Chiron and your moon, that you're human, that you can tolerate negative things, that you don't love yourself, and so forth. There's hope for an idealized world in that section of the chart, and it tries to cover up that we have a Chiron in a moon in our chart. So that sets us up. We're limited, we're fragmented, we weren't loved unconditionally. I want to hide that. I hide it with Neptune. In that area of the chart, I'm going to put on these rose-colored glasses, and that's where I'm going to show that things are great. And then Pluto, next slide, comes to sort of shatter the Neptune. So all that's where I get the snow globe idea, is shattered. And you're like, oh, wait, we're all wounded children. We're all limited in our experience of love. That's where we can be universal. So that's why sort of like the Satan or the devil leads us to the God, right? That just juxtaposition that we hear. So Pluto is crisis and death does not have to be physical death, but let me take you up here, ego death, right? So in order to kind of kill this ego death, the things that we've taken personally that have happened to us, Pluto leads us right back to this universal feeling and knowing that we're all somewhat rejected, abandoned, fallen, kicked out of the Garden of Eden. And we all need that devil to bring us here. And so at the beginning of Dante's Divine Comedy, he starts first with Inferno, then he goes to Purgatorio, and then he goes to Paradiso. Here, at the beginning, as you're entering Inferno, he says, abandon all hope. Because hope is what keeps us from recognizing we're all the same. We all possess the 9 circles of hell. We all possess the capacity. So those devils that we think we are not, we turn out to recognize that we are, is exactly what leads us back to that ego death that Pluto wants us to have, so that we can recognize everybody has something here that they're going to suffer from, that they're going to have a crisis from. So
Helpful devil.
I'm sorry?
A helpful devil.
Yes, helpful devil. So, and oftentimes, right, it's the devil, whatever that devil is in our life, that leads us to seeking the God or that creator, that universal consciousness, whatever you call it. And so they work together so that we can accept the world. There are aspects of the world that are very beautiful, right? You've met people. All of us at some point have said people suck, right? But we've also said, wow, that person's an angel in my life. And that's the point of this. It's to recognize that we're all devils and angels. We're all Neptunian and Plutonian, and bring us to that Chiron moon, that we're all wounded children looking for some recognition and acceptance of ourselves and our wounded and brokenness. And that's how we really bring all that unconscious conscious. But we need the Pluto in order to do that, to get back to that Chiron moon. And so it allows us to accept that we're wounded children, that we can tolerate our own brokenness, and then the achievement, the goal is that we become fully whole and integrated, all of the parts, our idealistic, naive, childish parts, our devilish parts that are capable of probably a lot of darkness and harm too, all those shadow pieces, and recognize that we indeed are just humans, and acceptance of all of those parts. So when we are discerning unconscious motivations, we need to recognize that all of us have a fear of rejection, abandonment, that naivete we all have in some area. We can see the most person with such strength and gall and facing life, but then there's this one area where they're just so naive, maybe with their animals or their partner, right? And you're like, how are they so weak, or how are they so innocent in that area when they're like taking on life, by the balls, so to speak, so we can see that everybody has that area. Recognizing that attachment theory includes that we have to own limiting beliefs, and that we are ultimately always looking for home. And even though home might have been physically unhealthy, physically painful, that is what we are seeking in our psyche, and we will replicate some version of that, perhaps a little less intense in that sort of pain and crisis, but we don't really verge too far from the sort of difficulties and sufferings of our childhood. And that the death drives enter the unconscious to shatter that idealism so that we can accept ourselves and others in their entirety. I love this quote from Jung. Obviously, astrology has much to offer psychology, but what does psychology offer its older sister, astrology. So far as I judge, it would seem to me advantageous for astrology to take the existence of psychology into account. Above all, the psychology of the personality and of the unconscious. The map of our chart shows us exactly where that devil is going to enter, what naivete and innocence needs to be sort of shattered, why we can accept ourselves fully with all of our limitations, all of our, belief systems, how we can tolerate things that maybe people find intolerable. It really is such a visual gift of what our insides are so that we can really learn this self-acceptance and not self-worth and self-love, but self-acceptance. So first, by the way, this is a great book by Liz Green and Howard Saspataz. She talks about a lot of these planets in there. If you have never read her books, she has like a theory section in the front, archetypal, and she talks about the breakdown of the archetypes of the planets in the chart. And she is a depth psychologist as well. And then the rest of the books usually are seminars, and you see the question and answer transcript from her seminar. So you have a chart, and she goes through the practical application of it. So first you want to identify your moon sign and the house, and identify by sign first and then by house your definition of love, and getting to a place of accepting that this is how you're going to view love, accept love, look for love, want love, and why other people's definitions don't serve you because you have your own. And that's an internal thing that began at conception and, of course, through the womb. Next, you look for your Chiron sign and what you're lacking. Because of this lack, you're trying to overcompensate and be the opposite, right? I have a Chiron in Aries. I have an identity. I have no identity. I don't know who the hell I am, right? So I go through life. I know exactly who I am. And we overcompensate with that when really inside we're shuddering, which I call FOFO, this fear of being found out. Because if we don't know this about ourselves, then of course we're going to be rejected. So these are the main two unconscious aspects that you're trying to avoid anyone finding out, or that you may not even know about yourself. You actually might think that you're the opposite sign. You actually might think and believe egoically that you are that thing that you really are not, or you haven't yet figured out. Then your Neptune. Your Neptune sort of like shields you from the Chiron and the moon and says, oh, focus here, your happy, positive thoughts, your idealistic life, because then you don't have to really look deeper at your self-neglect, at your abusive stance, at your power struggles, etc. And then Pluto comes in to kind of open up, pop the pimple, if you will, and put it all out there so that you can start looking at the pieces. This is not only in the chart, but also through transits, right? When you have Pluto transits, most likely these things are going to come to surface. Right now, all of us have Neptune in Pisces. It's retrograde at 29 degrees. We only have that for a little while longer. And Neptune will never be in Pisces in our lifetime again, and it's going to Aries. So imagine collectively all of us having Neptune and Pisces, all of our delusions, all of our naivete, all of our innocence, wherever we have Pisces in our chart, is going to be just popped open. And when it goes to Aries, imagine what's coming in terms of bringing that really to the surface. So that's going to be universally something that we're going to experience. So these teachings go not only in the natal chart, but also obviously in the transits as well. So let me bring up your chart. Okay, so let's start with your moon. So your moon and Chiron are conjunct in Cancer. Okay, so here is where you start the nuance of the planet, the sign, and then the house placement. So even though, I want to know how you live this out because it's got to be really interesting. So Chiron and moon conjunct. Anybody who has a Chiron and moon conjunct expects to be disappointed by women. Off the bat, there was a wounding by a woman, primarily mother, grandmother, sister, close friend. That's right off the bat. And so the fact that it's in Cancer, it could have been that the mother that you wanted, the mother you thought of, the mother, 12th house, universal mother, like a moon in Pisces, that you expected earthly mom to be, whoever that was, it doesn't always have to be our birth mother, that surrogate person didn't show up as the house dress and cookies and a band-aid on your knee when you scraped it. That's the nuance of the Chiron moon in Cancer. Now add, this is interesting, I'm going to speak to your spiritual pride in a moment with that Mercury and all that Leo in the first. Then layer that as if it were Chiron and moon in Pisces. You're not only disappointed, neglected, rejected, abandoned by your earthly mother's lack of unconditional love, but the universal mother. So, Gaia did you dirty. So now you can't trust humans. You can't trust the cosmic womb. Guess who Haley has to rely on? Hence, all this Leo in the first. Me, 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 me. Now, you, and I've said this before, you have a big call to action with your chart, with all of this in the 12th. There's something to transmute here. There's something to end in terms of perhaps generational. It's all that ancestral Cancer stuff that you, with that Pluto in the fourth, we talked about, right? You're here to end cycles to start new ones. But imagine the level of spiritual pride when you can't trust the human, you can't trust the cosmic, and all the reliance is on yourself. So that's an interesting position with that Chiron and moon in Cancer / Pisces, because it really puts you as, I'm the only one I can trust. And what we need to understand by Jung's model of the collective unconscious is that we're all human. We're not self-reliant. We don't earn the praise and the grace and the mercy and the love of the universe and the cosmos, right? It's through the fact that you cannot be Atlas, that you cannot carry everyone, that you may not be able to end your generational trauma or your familial ancestral issues. That's exactly what positions you to be able to do it. That's a toughie. That's a call to action. That's a tough one. How do you live that? How do you experience, oh, I got to do it myself kind of thing, especially with all that Capricorn in the 6th?
Well, I just, as you were beginning to talk about like the history, like the root of it, yeah, I had a very negligent mother. She was just unavailable. She was depressed. She had her own maternal issues. She was adopted, never knew her biological family, and had lots of issues with her own mother. So it's just like this compounding sense of like, mom doesn't love me. I can't trust her. Yeah, and I feel like a little
How
bit
did
of
the
an
universe, how did this devil, and we talked about this before, the 4th house is your life cycle. The major alchemy and transmutation is coming. You're not going to die. Here's death. You're not going to die before really getting it. Okay, so that's the good news. Hallelujah, right? Especially we talked about also the sun at the cusp of the 12th going into the first. You're ending the cycle. You get it in this lifetime. However, how has the devil shown up for you to say, wait a minute, the neglect of mom, the neglect of the cosmic, universe, God, him or herself, doesn't work the way you expect it to? How has that devil shown up for you? It's in the 4th house, so it has to be internally, and it has to be in your own physical home, whether it's childhood or the one you've made with your partner. How has that shown up for you that your delusion was shattered, your innocence was shattered?
Well, that first house, 6th house Capricorn determination, like it, uh, we nurture ourselves, like it, I don't know, just recognizing that I'm responsible for my care ultimately.
Right. And first you, right?
Yeah.
This is
Yes.
universal. You want to
Yeah.
care for everyone, every animal, every rock, every mineral, every human, right? But this has to come first. And what's great about this Neptune in the 6 is this is your Christ consciousness. You can't develop this Christ consciousness, 6th house, Neptune, if you don't take care of yourself, your vessel, your mind, your body. All of the work you do for others, for humanity, does not nurture your Christ consciousness. That's what these oppositions may probably have you struggling with, wait a minute, is it me? Is it them? So this has to tell you, you have to take care of the vessel. The body is important. Your nervous system, Uranus is there. Your mental health, Neptune is there. Your bones, your physical structure, Saturn's in there. Like, you have so much to take care of here before you can be the world nurturer, right? Now I'm going to show you a little trick. I don't know if I've shown you this before. This is only for the fourth house, okay? It's for the third house too, but here's your fourth house in Libra at 15 degrees, right? It goes to 30. So you've got 15 years old plus another 14. So that's about what, 30 years old, give or take? How old are you?
I am 34.
Okay, so about now, you had to experience, which you did, a Pluto event in your physical home. So you take the degrees of the cusp, you add them to this degree 14 plus 2 and minus 2. That age, that whatever planet, it's not only Pluto, whoever has whatever planet in there. I have Chiron at the same place. At that age, give or take a year or two, you're going to have a life event of that, and you already experienced that. So that teaching had to show you that you needed to learn to take care of yourself and develop your own Christ consciousness and create safety in your home physically, your vessel, not just your physical four-walled address. That before you can tackle any of this. So Pluto supports the Neptune so that this can be okay. And you know what? The world is as the world is. And if the 12th house is the world as it is, everything fits. Abuse, neglect, abandoned children, children that are aborted, children that are abused, abandoned like your mom. You have to get okay with those things. It's very powerful, your chart. I always say that to you. But that's a little trick with the fourth house for people that have planets. They live that archetype. It's a law. Same thing in the third as well. This is kindergarten. This is high school, 12th grade. So you could see visually, maybe not so much the age, although it works too. But if they have something around here, it's usually about middle school, high school.
Okay.
And those two are pretty pretty powerful when you can just visually see and say, oh, what happened at X age or what happened in middle school? And they're like, what? I had a guy who had a South Node around middle school. And I said, what happened in middle school? Did you drop out? He goes, I dropped out. He goes, I went into computers. He dropped out of middle school. He got his GED. And that was because South Node was right at that line. So those two houses are really good for life cycle things to really just clearly say, oh, at that age,
This was pivotal. Yeah.
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 So that's very cool. Any questions that you have about Chiron, Neptune, any of the theories, the
No,
moon,
that was great.
Pluto? Yep.
Thank
Okay.
you.
Stop the recording, of course. Thank you. Okay.